Thank you so much for having me, and Casca, for inviting me to share some of my story, essentially, and also my experience of developing and producing a podcast called Wild for Scotland. I'm going to share my screen. I had a lot of fun on Canva earlier today. And put together a little presentation to so you don't just have to look at me, but you get to actually look at some nice pictures along as well, and read along. So yes, I've kind of titled it Creating Wild for Scotland, which is my podcast, but also my podcasting journey and how I use my voice for climate. There's kind of 4 things I want to do today. I want to tell you a bit about me and my own path and journey, the process of developing Wild for Scotland and how it all came to be and how it has evolved since I started it. I want to talk a bit about podcasting for nature and how that plays into my own podcast and my own kind of content strategy. And then, like Casca said, at the end, we'll have time for questions, a discussion, anything that you might want to contribute or ask at the end. So to start off a bit about me, my name is Kathi. Like I said, I'm originally from Vienna, but have lived in Glasgow for almost 10 years now. I came for university and fell in love with the country and decided to stay and just never left, which is quite nice. And I'm very grateful that was possible with everything politically that has been going on in the world in the last few years. So here I am. I'm a travel writer. I guess that would be my main way to describe what I do. I write or have written for travel magazines, and particularly online magazines and websites, since 2010, so for quite a while. I also run my own Scotland travel blog called Watch Me See. It's a very practical resource with guides and tips for traveling around Scotland. And I also plan custom itineraries for people who want to come and visit. So it's very much kind of tourism focused, but because of my personal interests in nature and in responsible tourism, those are all things that kind of influence the kind of travelers I work with and the kinds of tourism I want to encourage and the kinds of experiences I promote as well, through my content and the work I do with my clients. And I guess overall, you could say I'm a marketing expert. I always find that a little bit tricky because the marketing world moves on so quickly and things constantly change. But I guess I'm particularly passionate about building online communities and understanding how to communicate messages to new audiences and existing audiences, and kind of put the two together and bring people together who share an interest and share a passion in something. So that's kind of a little bit of an introduction to me. My podcast is called Wild for Scotland. I started it it started in my head in 2020 during the pandemic. I think, like many other people, and I was in a very fortunate position, I guess, throughout the pandemic in many ways, but like many other people, I found myself with a lot of time on my hand and a bit of an existential crisis because, of course, as the tourism industry came to a complete stillstand, all of a sudden, the things I would normally do for work weren't possible. And the things I normally created, like travel guides and tips and really useful resources, weren't actually useful to anybody because no one was able to travel. So there was a loss of business, but also just something to do in many ways, and a bit of an identity loss as well, because, of course, so much of what we do influences who we are, maybe not always in the most positive way, but it did that to me. And at the same time, I discovered a love for podcasts, and I had a lot of time to listen to a lot of podcasts. And I thought audio became this medium that really brought me joy and made me feel connected with other people and with people across the world in a way as well. And it gave me something to do. It filled a lot of time. So I think in 2020, those two things came together, that towards the end of the year, I thought, can I do my own podcast? Is that maybe something I can do to fill my time and to produce also something that would be useful to people where they are right now? And at the time, I got a lot of messages and emails from readers and from just people who follow me on social media and who've used my resources in the past, saying that it really helps them looking at photos and videos and listening to stories to still feel connected with the places that they feel passionate about or that they dream about visiting. So I thought, is that something I can do? So at the start of 2021, I decided to do a podcast and started developing the concept for it. We then launched the first season of Wild for Scotland in March 2021, and we have since produced 4 seasons and nearly 50 episodes. And we do it in seasons, so it's about 10 episodes at a time, plus here and there a few extras. And I say we because I have a co-producer who has been with me from the start, helping me kind of shaping the idea of the podcast. And now she also edits it and does the sound design for it. So she's become an even more active collaborator in the process of creating the podcast as well. And for every season, I pick a different theme to design kind of a journey for the listener throughout those 10 episodes, to take them on a different kind of experience of Scotland. And what we do is I tell stories. So it's not a show with travel tips primarily. It's not primarily interviews. It's very much immersive narration that takes people to places that I personally find inspiring or beautiful. And we use soundscapes to give listeners the sense of being there in the moment with me. So that's the main part of what we do for the show. And kind of looking ahead to autumn 2023. So this year, we're currently working on season 5 to be launched in September. And I will tell you a little bit about the kind of development process of that season as we go along today. But first, I wanted to kind of talk a bit more about the development of the podcast itself, because I think that the work that went into thinking through the podcast before I started recording was probably definitely the most important part of developing and creating a podcast. So all the work and time that went into thinking about these things on the slide were what set the podcast up for success, and the fact that I'm still doing it 2.5 years later. There's 5 things on the list. The first one is the audience, and I think that is the first question you need to ask yourself if you want to create a podcast, is who will listen to the podcast? Who is it for? Who do I want to reach? And most importantly, what do they need? Like I said earlier, for me, it was, I noticed that people needed to feel connected with Scotland in some way. And that was the kind of driving force behind developing the idea for Wild for Scotland. So I think the audience, the people who actually listen to your podcast, should be at the very core of developing your concept for your show. The next question then is about the format or the content of the show. Are you going to do a scripted or an unscripted podcast? Should you do interviews? And what sections will make up an episode? Is there something that you want to repeat, for example, in every episode to make it recognizable and consistent as well? Here you can also ask yourself, what do you want to say? So it's about the audience and what they want, what they need, but it's also about what you find interesting and what you want to dive into enough and what you feel passionate about enough to produce multiple episodes of a podcast. And you might also want to ask yourself what you can contribute. So what is it that you can say that no one else can say? What makes it specifically your podcast and makes you stand out from other people as well? Then you move on to thinking about marketing. And I think once the first 2 are in place, or once you've thought through the first 2 questions, marketing is a thing that a lot of people forget about. But essentially, no matter whether you run a business or a podcast, is going to make up about 50% of what you do for the rest of the time it's live. It's really, really important to think about how you will promote your show and how you're going to reach new audiences and how you're going to reach audiences that don't know yet that they're interested in what you're producing and what you have to say as well. So marketing is a really big aspect of any podcast creation and most other businesses as well. Next, and I think this is very important to keep in mind, is sustainability. And I don't necessarily mean sustainability in the sense of climate or eco-friendliness, but rather about sustainability for yourself as the creator of the podcast, and asking yourself what is feasible for you. How many episodes can you produce, and in what time frame can you do them? How can you stay consistent and deliver podcast episodes on a regular basis without making you feel like you're chasing your own tail and you're actually making yourself more work than you can do realistically. So for me, that meant producing seasons and 10 episodes at a time, rather than trying to produce a new episode every week of the year. Even 10 was quite difficult because of the concept of the show. It's a lot of writing and storytelling and refining. So we've since changed that a little bit. For example, this year, instead of 2 seasons, I'm only producing 1 full season, because I knew now from experience that producing 20 stories a year is just way too much for me. And then finally, very consciously at the very end, is the tech question around what recording equipment to use, what microphones, what software you should use for editing, where do you record, at home in a studio, or at home at your desk? Do you rent a studio? Do you go on location and record out and about? It's important to think through, but it's not as important as you think. I think if the first 4 questions, if you don't have an answer to those, but an answer to the tech question, it's not necessarily going to make for a good podcast. The tech question really adds quality, but I think the podcast needs to be able to stand on its own, regardless of what microphone you use, at least as well at the very start. You can start with your phone, as people say, and a pair of headphones. But just to have it there, I did want to include a slide with my current tech setup, because I know people are often interested in what kind of mics you use, especially for recording on location. I'm not going to go through this too much, but this way it's eternalized in the presentation and on YouTube. And you can, if you're watching this in catch up, pause the video here and kind of see what equipment I personally use for Wild for Scotland. Now, very briefly, I wanted to talk about the upcoming season 5 and the story of developing it. In my head, I'm actually already also working on season 6, and it was very similar with season 5. The idea for a season, to me, starts about a year before I really produce the season and until it launches. The kind of key moment for me for this season was attending the Marine Forum at Glasgow University last October. It was a super inspiring event with all kinds of marine science disciplines in a room, and people presenting their work and their research, but also artists and activists and science communicators coming together to talk about different aspects and topics within marine sciences, but also how marine environments are affected by climate change, for example, but many other things as well. So that kind of sparked the idea of creating a season around Scottish waters. Initially, I thought I would do it about the ocean. And then since then, moving on to stage 2, I decided to broaden that and also talk about freshwater, bogs, rivers, freshwater lochs, possibly canals. I'm not 100% sure yet entirely. But yeah, the kind of inspiration stage, there's a lot of reading books, doing research, reading articles, and having conversations with people who maybe sit at that intersection of storytelling and communication, activism and science, and see what they think about the idea. Like I said, then stage 2 is picking the actual theme, deciding how broad I'm gonna interpret that. Usually the broader, the kind of better, because it gives you more freedom. And then I've made a plan for 10 episodes. This is relatively fluid, so at that point things can still change. I might I might be introduced to someone who I definitely want to have as an interview guest, and then I have to shuffle things around, make space, and maybe reconceptualize episodes. Or I might have had a plan to get multiple people in an episode, and then I speak to one and I know that that's going to fill an entire episode and I don't want to cut them short. So things are still kind of changing, and this is the process I'm in right now. But seeing that we're launching in September, I'm also already dipping my toes into stage 3, actually gathering the material, that's writing the stories, doing the experiences to then write about, recording interviews, and doing a bit more research to see other people I can include, other areas or activities I can include in the season as well. So these two overlap and things are moving around. And that's where I am right now. So we're aiming to produce in advance, which is always lovely, but realistically, not always possible. But yeah, we're early this year, which I think just goes to show that the fact that I didn't produce another season in the spring this year allowed me to think about these things in a bit more depth earlier on than normally. So like I said, my show is primarily about travel. It's not a climate podcast as such, but I do podcast for nature. In my head, it's a show that talks about nature and Scottish landscapes and how we affect them and also how we can experience them. I'd like to think about creating nature-based content for audiences that don't know that they're interested in nature-based content, or who are not necessarily listening to get educated about climate. I call it backdoor education. So I kind of tease them in with something they think they want, which is stories, travel stories from Scotland. But really, in my script, I try to incorporate facts and stories about climate, about wildlife, about how landscapes have changed throughout history as well, and how communities have changed as well, and how positive and negative things kind of affect these places that people love to visit. I try to make nature a character, often the main character of a story, even though I write in first person about myself. To me, it's really important to make the setting just as important as the person that I maybe meet on my journeys. I use recordings from on location, so I try to deliver accurate and immersive soundscapes that really sound like the places that I describe in the stories. I do sometimes use footage audio footage from platforms as well, but I try to deliver as accurate a soundscape as I can from the places that I feature. It's also a lot about personal integrity and the stories I want to tell, because as my own interests shift and as I myself learn more about climate and the environment and how we impact it, the more I want to talk about that. And I think as a content creator who has people who listen to what I have to say because they're interested in my travel advice, I feel like I have a responsibility to use that voice and that position to also talk about the other things I'm passionate about and to talk about the things that affect the places we want to visit. And then finally, the kind of element of partnership is important as well. I try to create strategic partnerships with organizations and brands to create new episodes. It's not easy to find sponsorship for a small, very niche podcast like Wild for Scotland. And I also don't want to just partner with anyone. It's really about finding the right organizations that align with my ethics for the kind of tourism and the kind of travel experience I want to promote and encourage people to have in Scotland. I have two examples of episodes I've created in the last kind of half year. One was a sponsored partnership with Scotland The Big Picture, one of the big rewilding organisations in Scotland. They gave me a content brief to create an episode about what they do, and particularly their Next Gen programme, which is for young people to get involved with rewilding. It was a very collaborative partnership to create an episode that included what they wanted to say, their key messaging, but also was true to what we normally do on our podcast and remained relevant to our audiences who, like I said earlier, might not know that they're actually interested in rewilding, for example, in this case. So making it interesting to them and getting that educational aspect in through the back door, catching them a little off guard, hopefully. And yeah, the goal of this partnership was to engage an audience that was new to the rewilding movement, and wasn't already within the kind of network of people who know about that sort of climate action, and who came in through a different angle, in my case, the kind of tourism sector. And I've got a 1-minute clip, if that's okay.
Is there anything that gives...
Oh, God.
Is there anything that gives you hope about Scotland's natural environment?
Oh, there's loads of it.
That's good.
Yeah, I was actually doing a workshop with a group of kids at work last week, and we ended up talking about animals that are native to Scotland, and one of them mentioned bears. And I was like, yeah, we used to have bears. I was like, we don't anymore. I was like, do you know why we don't anymore? And he was like, were they hunted? And I was like, yeah, probably. That's the main thing. And then he was like, wolves. And I was like, yeah, we also used to have them. I was like, what happened to them? And he was like, they got hunted. And I was like, yep. And then I was like, what about beavers? And he was like, they got hunted as well. I was like, yeah, but they're back now. They've been brought back. And he was like, really? I was like, yeah. And he was like, where are they? So I was telling him sort of Knapdale and over in Perthshire as well. And
okay, so that was just a 1-minute clip from one of the conversations I had for that episode with one of the young rewilders who were part of the Next Gen programme. And that question of hope came up, I think, multiple times with him and other speakers as well. And it was just a really nice way to describe what's happening in Scotland right now, and gives me a link to then talk in the upcoming season a bit about beavers as well, and where you can find them in Scotland, which, yes, is very exciting, and I look forward to going to see the beavers next week. So another episode I did last winter was inspired by the snorkeling artist residency I did at the Argyll Hope Spot. It's the first Hope Spot in mainland Britain, and the residency was included 2 weekends last summer where 10 artists came together to snorkel, learn about the marine environment of the Hope Spot on the west coast of Scotland, and then create art together. And in my case, the result was a podcast episode with poems and music. The music was contributed by one of the other artists. And I submitted one of the poems to the Climate Creatives Challenge earlier this year, and it received a commendation. So I can call it an award-winning podcast episode, I think. And it was a very different style for me to write poetry rather than narrative. I do have a clip with some video. It's 4 minutes long, so I don't think we have time for the full thing. But I'm going to try to jump forward to about the start of the narration, just so you get a sense of the soundscape and how that worked together with video footage I recorded during the snorkeling residency as well. So here we go. Jump forward now. A hope spot is a place where there is hope. Not just optimism. I don't believe, I don't wish, I don't imagine, I hope. Hope isn't passive. It requires action, by you and by me. We must all take action if we want to have hope. And if we do take action, there's hope for this place. I hope that I'm not the only one who sees this, figuratively and literally. I hope that others get to experience this place, but that experiencing it with their own senses is not a prerequisite for their care, their attention, their action. I hope that the images I made in my mind will never fade. I draw and I photograph and I write to avoid it. I hope that making the right choices becomes easier for all, not just the fortunate few. I hope that each and every one of us feels ownership, no, stewardship, a sense of belonging. We as a part of the microcosm of life in this place, the place belonging to us, relying on us, needing us, our hope and our action. I hope that you hear about this spot, see it, experience it, immerse yourself in the shallows and the depths. Forge a relationship with the creatures above and below. They are our hope, and we are theirs. I'm going to pause here. I still get goosebumps when I hear Jen's piano music. So yes, the ambition for this and the other poems and the residency, I guess, in total, was to create art and engage people with places that they might otherwise not reach, or probably don't even know that they exist and are so rich in wildlife and biodiversity as well. And finding ways to translate those natural experiences and how dazzling and beautiful they were into pieces of art. And yeah, it was a great joy to write these poems and produce something that was so out of my comfort zone, and still is a little bit showing it to other people. I like to publish things and then ignore the fact that they are published and available to everybody. So yeah, I live in denial every day that the fact that other people listen to my stories and my words for nature and for the climate emergency.